Rosalind Fenchurch, 33 and widowed 11 months, knelt in the wet bracken of Wraxall Wood at first light, and sprang the 7th Mantrap with her bare hands. The jaws slammed shut. On nothing. On air. On the stick she had wedged between the plates a half-second before the trigger caught. She exhaled slowly, the way she had taught herself to exhale 11 months ago. That was when the world had first shown her exactly how little it intended to protect her. She did not flinch. She had stopped flinching in April. Above her, on the ridge where the birches thinned, a man stood watching. He was the sort a person might not notice if they had not spent a childhood learning to notice such things. The Duke of Ashvale watched her spring the 8th trap and said nothing at all. He had known she was there before she reached the 2nd trap that morning. In truth, he had known for 4 nights running. His gamekeeper had come to him white-faced, reporting that someone was disarming the traps laid along the disputed boundary line. Those traps had been laid illegally, if the truth were told. His own late steward had set them in a fit of proprietary spite just before his dismissal. They were meant to catch poachers. Instead, they had caught the conscience of everyone who now knew of them, and could not undo them without confessing they existed at all. Gerard Ashworth, 7th Duke of Ashvale, was 36 years old. He had a build more suited to riding fence lines than to ballrooms, and a bearing the ton had long ago decided to call cold. He had spent 4 nights deciding what to do about the woman in Wraxall Wood. In the end, he decided to do nothing, to watch, to let her finish what she had started. Some part of him understood this. It was the part his father had never quite managed to beat out of him, though God knew the old man had tried. A woman who sprang man-traps with her bare hands before dawn was not a woman who wanted rescuing. She was a woman settling an account. It would be many weeks before he learned the whole of why. What he knew, standing on that ridge in the grey hour before the wood woke properly, was this. Rosalind Fenchurch had been left, upon the death of her husband the previous June, with a cottage at the edge of Ashvale land. She had also been left a debt she had not incurred, and a dead man's reputation for having sold information about the estate's boundary disputes to whichever party paid best. The debt was real. The reputation, Gerard suspected, was a lie. He had not yet proven it, and proof was the entire reason he had said nothing to anyone, including her. But he suspected a dead man had been made convenient to blame for a living man's theft. She straightened over the 8th trap and rubbed her palms against her skirts. She did not look toward the ridge, though she had known, since the 2nd night, exactly who stood there. She had decided, for her own reasons, to let him watch. There is a particular arithmetic that widows learn. Rosalind had learned hers with brutal efficiency. In the 11 months since Edmund's death, she had catalogued every debt owed and every debt she was owed. She had discovered that the ledger did not balance. Somewhere in her late husband's affairs, there was a discrepancy the size of a small fortune. That discrepancy pointed, with the quiet insistence of arithmetic, toward Ashvale's own land agent, a Mr. Pruitt. He had a fondness for gaming tables in Bath, and a habit of visiting them with rather more coin than his salary explained. She could not prove it, not yet, but she had learned, in a hard year, that proof was often buried under exactly the kind of thing she was now digging through. A dead man's obligations, an estate's boundary, a set of illegal traps that someone in authority had every incentive to leave in place, because a trapped poacher could not testify to what he had seen while poaching. Someone had wanted those traps left standing. She intended to know who. The 9th trap took longer. It had rusted, and the mechanism fought her hands. For a moment, one unguarded moment, the kind she rationed to herself as carefully as she rationed her coal, she allowed her shoulders to sag with the effort of it. A sound escaped her that was not quite a sob and not quite a curse. It was not the sort of sound dignified women were meant to make in wet woods before witnesses. On the ridge, Gerard's hand closed hard around a birch branch. He did not go down. He wanted to. Wanting to was, he told himself, entirely beside the point. His own wound ran deeper than the woods knew, deeper than the ton knew, deeper than anyone knew save the physician who had signed the certificate 3 years past, and the brother it had named. Frederick had been his younger brother, his only brother. 26, reckless, beloved in the particular helpless way one loves what one cannot save. He had gone under at Ashvale's own lake in the dead of a February night, drunk on his own despair, and a fortune he had gambled and lost twice over. Gerard had been 40 minutes too late, arriving from London, to do anything but identify the body. He had spent the 3 years since learning precisely how much duty a man could shoulder before the shouldering itself became a kind of armor. He had become, in the Tun's estimation, cold, formidable. A duke who did not attend balls he could avoid, and did not marry, though every mother in 3 counties had a daughter she considered his obvious remedy. He had accepted, without quite admitting it to himself, that he would likely go on this way. Duty by day, silence by evening. The estate's ledgers balanced with the precision that had become, in its own quiet way, a form of penance. He had told his mother, the dowager, that he had no present interest in courtship. She had stopped raising the subject some 18 months past. He suspected, privately, that she had merely stopped raising it aloud. He had not told anyone that he had spent those 3 years convinced, with the particular unreasoning guilt of the elder brother, that he ought to have seen it coming. He had been too occupied with the estate, too occupied with the ledgers, too occupied, in fact, with the very kind of quiet financial rot even now eating at Wraxall's boundary. He had not noticed his own brother drowning, in the ordinary sense of the word, months before he drowned in the literal one. He had not told anyone that watching a woman spring traps alone in his own wood had cracked something in his chest. She refused every appearance of needing him. 3 years of duty had not managed to touch what she had touched in 4 mornings. What no one in that house yet understood was that the Duke of Ashvale had begun, without quite deciding to, keeping a private ledger of his own, not of coin, of every unguarded thing he had observed Rosalind Fenchurch do when she believed herself unwatched. The 10th trap sprang clean. She had gotten faster. By the time she had cleared the 14th and last, the sun had cleared the birches properly. She permitted herself, finally, to look up at the ridge. He did not pretend he had not been watching. That, she would later admit to herself, was the first thing about him that surprised her. "Your Grace?" She said it without curtsy, without apology. The 2 words carried the precise weight of a woman informing a man that she knew exactly what he was, and did not intend to perform a deference she had not been paid to perform. "Mrs. Fenchurch." He came down from the ridge at his own pace, unhurried, and stopped a careful distance from her, close enough to speak without shouting, far enough that she would not mistake it for a man closing in. "You have been busy in my wood." "Your steward's traps. Illegal ones, I believe, under the Act, though I imagine you know that better than I do." "I know it considerably better than I would like to." Something moved behind his eyes. Hazel, she noted. An unexpected warm brown-green, rather than the ice she had half expected of a man with his reputation. It occurred to her that she had built an entire idea of him from gossip, and found the idea wanting within 30 seconds of the man himself. "Pruitt laid them before I was aware there was a boundary dispute worth laying them over. I've been attempting to establish precisely how long they have been there, and why, without alerting Pruitt that I am attempting it." She considered this. She had spent 11 months learning to distrust every convenient explanation offered to her by men with reasons to want her quiet. She did not intend to stop distrusting them, merely because this one had kind eyes and an inconvenient habit of watching her from ridges. "Then we have," she said carefully, "the same question about the same man." It would be many weeks before either of them said aloud what that sentence had actually cost them both to admit. She did not explain herself further that morning, and he did not ask her to. He walked her the half-mile back to the cottage's edge, in a silence that was, she noted with some private astonishment, not uncomfortable. At the boundary stone he stopped. "The traps will not be relaid," he said. "You have my word, for whatever that is presently worth to you." "Very little, Your Grace. I have found, this year, that words are the cheapest currency in England." Then I will have to pay in something else. She did not know, walking away, what he meant by it. She would learn. The wood had been, for 11 months, the one place Rosalind could be entirely herself. Not the grieving widow the village expected. Not the suspected accomplice the magistrate half believed her to be. Not the penniless woman 3 separate solicitors had explained her own situation to, as though she were incapable of arithmetic. In the wood, she was simply a woman with a debt to settle, and hands that had learned, out of necessity, to do things ladies were not meant to do. She had learned to spring traps from a poacher's widow 2 villages over, in exchange for mending the woman's limens. She had learned to read estate boundary maps from her own late husband, in the last good year before his debts had swallowed them both. Back when she had believed, foolishly she now understood, that a marriage built on affection could survive a fortune built on nothing. Edmund had not sold information to anyone. She was almost entirely certain of that now. But almost was not proof. A dead man could not defend himself against a magistrate who found it convenient to believe the worst of him. Believing the worst of a dead man was so very much less trouble than investigating a living one. She had catalogued Pruitt's movements for 6 weeks. She had noted his visits to Bath, his new boots, the fact that a man on a land agent's salary did not generally purchase new boots twice in one season. She had noted, too, that the boundary dispute the traps supposedly protected ran suspiciously close to a parcel of land Pruitt's own cousin had recently, quietly, acquired. She had noted all of it in a small ledger, kept sewn into the lining of her second-best cloak. A woman with nothing else left had learned to protect the one thing she did have, which was information. The Duke of Ashvale, for his part, had a ledger of his own, kept rather less methodically in the back of his mind, where he kept the things he was not yet ready to examine directly. He had begun to notice that his days now ranged themselves, without his quite intending it, around the possibility of encountering her. A ride that happened to pass the cottage, a query to his steward about the boundary that happened to require a conversation at the very hedge where she liked to walk in the evenings. He told himself this was diligence. He had told himself a great many convenient things in 3 years of grief, and had gotten rather practiced at believing them. Had anyone been watching closely, they might have seen the precise moment his diligence became something else. It was a Tuesday, 6 weeks into the arrangement, when Rosalind arrived at Ashvale's own study, uninvited, and laid the ledger from her cloak lining on his desk without preamble. "Pruitt's cousin holds the deed to the northern parcel," she said. "Registered in early March, 3 months after your steward's traps went up along that exact boundary. I believe your steward laid them to keep witnesses off the land while the transaction settled. And I believe my husband's death, and the debts attached to his name, made a convenient place to hide the money that changed hands to make it happen." Gerard read the ledger in silence. It took him the better part of 10 minutes. When he finished, he looked at her. 33, widowed, in a cloak with a false lining, having built a case against his own land agent out of boot leather and a dead man's arithmetic. His expression was one she had not yet learned to read, because she had not yet seen it directed at her. "You have done," he said slowly, "in 6 weeks, what I have failed to do in 3 months, with the resources of an entire dukedom. I had considerably more motivation, Your Grace. My name is presently attached to the crime. Yours is merely attached to the land. Then let us attach yours to the solution instead." She had not expected an alliance. She had expected, if she was honest, something rather different. She had expected that a duke presented with proof of his own agent's theft would simply take the proof. He would thank her with the minimum courtesy the situation required. He would then proceed to solve his own problem, without further need of the widow who had done the actual solving. Men of his rank rarely required a woman's continued presence, once her usefulness had been extracted. She had watched it happen to her own mother once, with a different lord and a different debt, and she had not forgotten the lesson. But the season was not yet finished with either of them. What followed was not swift. Pruitt was cautious, and his cousin more cautious still. The two of them spent the better part of a month laying groundwork rather than springing it. Gerard quietly reassigned Pruitt's duties, under pretext of estate reorganization. Rosalind continued her observations from the cottage. The two of them met at the boundary stone with a regularity that the village, inevitably, began to notice and discuss. She did not care what the village said. She had stopped caring what anyone said, in April, when caring had cost her more than she could afford. He found that he cared a great deal what she thought. For a man who had spent 3 years believing himself incapable of caring what anyone thought of anything, that was its own kind of small catastrophe. He did not mention it to her. He suspected, correctly, that she would have found the admission entirely too soon. It was at the boundary stone that she finally asked it. The evening was thick with the smell of wet bracken and coal smoke, drifting up from the cottage chimneys below. She had been rationing the question since the first morning in the wood. "Why did you not simply come down the ridge that first day and tell me to stop?" He considered the question longer than she expected. "Because you were not doing anything I had any right to stop." He paused. She watched him decide, visibly, to finish the sentence rather than retreat from it. "And because I had spent 3 years watching everyone around me handle their grief by performing it, or hiding it, or handing it to someone else to manage. You were simply doing the work of it, alone, before dawn, with your bare hands. I found I did not want to interrupt the only honest thing I had seen anyone do in 3 years." She did not ask what grief he meant. She had heard, by then, the shape of the story the village told about the drowned younger brother. She understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had learned her own losses the hard way, that a man did not offer that admission lightly. He did not deserve to have it pried further open by a woman merely because she was curious. She offered him, instead, the thing her own hard year had taught her to offer instead of pity. She said nothing further. She did not look away. She let the silence between them hold the weight he had just set down, without either of them being obliged to pick it back up. He would tell her, months later, that the not looking away had done more to crack him open than any word could have. By the beginning of July, the arrangement between them had become something the village had stopped merely discussing and started, in its careful way, to expect. Rosalind still walked to the wood before dawn most mornings, though there were no traps left to spring. She walked because the habit of it steadied her. The wet bracken and the birdsong before sunrise had become the closest thing she owned to peace. More often than not, she found the Duke of Ashvale already there. He no longer watched from the ridge. He waited at the boundary stone instead, with 2 horses, and no explanation required. They did not speak of marriage. Neither of them had earned the right to speak of it yet, or so each privately believed, though for entirely different reasons. Rosalind would not be wooed by a man's rank. She had learned, from Edmund, precisely how little a good name could shelter a woman when a fortune failed beneath it. Gerard would not offer marriage as a rescue. He had watched her spend a year refusing to be rescued by anyone, and he did not intend to insult the one thing about her he had come to admire most. What they did, instead, was work. Together they traced the last threads of Pruitt's dealings. A solicitor had witnessed the cousin's purchase. A bank clerk remembered a deposit larger than any land agent's salary ought to explain. A stable boy recalled a night ride to the boundary stone the week before the traps went up. Rosalind's ledger grew thick with corroboration. Gerard's patience, honed over 3 years of quiet grief, proved equal to the slow work of building a case that could not be dismissed as a widow's grievance or a duke's overreach. Some evenings the work gave way to something gentler, though neither of them named it as such. He taught her, once, the correct way to address a dowager marchioness, and she laughed at the absurdity of it until he laughed too. She taught him, in turn, how to tell a rusted trap mechanism from a merely stiff one. She held his hand steady over the plate, the way the poacher's widow had once held hers. He noted, silently, that her hands were no longer as rough as they had been the morning he first watched her from the ridge. He did not say so aloud. He suspected she would not have thanked him for noticing, and he had learned, by then, precisely which observations were his to keep. It was Rosalind who noticed, one evening in early summer, that Pruitt had grown nervous. A man who is certain of his innocence does not sell a disputed parcel twice. but a man who fears discovery sometimes panics into precisely that error. Pruitt's cousin, growing anxious at the reassignment of Pruitt's duties, began quietly seeking a second buyer for the northern parcel. This new buyer was even less scrupulous than himself, and considerably less careful. "He will overreach," Rosalind said to Gerard. They stood at the boundary stone, on an evening when the last of the light was turning the wet grass to copper. "Frightened men always do. We need only wait for the paper to exist." "And if it does not exist in time," he asked, "then we will have to become considerably more frightening than he is." Gerard laughed at that, a short, surprised sound, as though laughter itself were a language he had half forgotten how to speak. It was, Rosalind would later admit, the first time she had heard it, and she found she wanted to hear it again. Pruitt came to the cottage himself once, in the last week of June, though neither Rosalind nor Gerard had expected he would dare it. He arrived at dusk, uninvited, smelling of the gaming tables even at that hour. He stood at her door with the particular bravado of a man who suspects he is already lost. Such a man gambles on bluster, because he has nothing left to gamble on retreat. "You would do well, Mrs. Fenchurch, to leave matters as they stand," he said, without preamble. "A widow's word carries little weight against a land agent's. You will find that out, to your cost, if you press this further." Rosalind did not invite him in. She stood in her own doorway, in the last of the daylight, and looked at him with the flat, unhurried composure she had spent 11 months perfecting for exactly this sort of man. "My husband's word carried less weight than yours once, Mr. Pruitt, and it was a lie that did it. I find I have grown rather tired of watching dead men lose arguments they never had the chance to make. You are welcome to try your luck with the living." "You cannot prove a thing." "I can prove considerably more than you believe. I have taken the precaution of ensuring the proof does not live solely in this cottage. Should anything unfortunate befall me, Mr. Pruitt, you will find your difficulties considerably multiplied rather than resolved." This was not strictly true on the evening she said it. The ledger's copies would not be lodged with Gerard's solicitor until the following week, but she delivered the sentence with such flat certainty that Pruitt's bravado faltered visibly. He left without another word, walking rather more quickly than he had arrived, and did not look back at the cottage even once. She told Gerard of the visit the following morning, at the boundary stone, and watched something harden in his face that she had not seen there before. "He came to your door, at dusk, alone." "He came, and he left, and I am entirely unharmed, which is rather more, I should think, than he can say for his own prospects." She said it lightly, deliberately. She had learned something about men like Gerard. Presented with a threat to something they had quietly come to value, such men tended toward exactly the kind of protective overreach that would help no one. It would expose everything they had worked so patiently to conceal. "I do not require rescuing from a frightened man's empty bluster, Your Grace. I require you to finish building the case before he tries something considerably less empty." He did not argue the point, though it cost him something to let it stand. He arranged, within the week, for a manservant to walk the lane past her cottage each evening, on an entirely unrelated pretext. He did not tell her he had done so. She noticed within 3 days regardless, and said nothing about it either. She had decided, by then, that some forms of care were easier accepted in silence than acknowledged aloud, and this, she thought, was very much one of them. The reckoning came in July. Pruitt's cousin, growing desperate, attempted to sell the northern parcel a second time. In doing so, he left a paper trail so careless that Rosalind's original ledger, presented alongside it before the counting magistrate, made the case entire. Pruitt was dismissed in disgrace. His cousin's second purchase was voided for fraud. The debt that had hung over Edmund Fenchurch's name for 11 months was, at last, formally and publicly attached to the man who had actually incurred it. The magistrate, a dry and unhurried man named Justice Aldrich, took some pains to note for the record what the case had actually cost to build. It had been built, in its entirety, upon the private diligence of Mrs. Fenchurch herself. The county, he said, owed her rather more gratitude than it had shown her in the past 11 months. Rosalind accepted the acknowledgement with the same composure she had brought to every trap in Wraxall Wood. Her hands, folded before her, were not entirely steady. Rosalind stood in the magistrate's chambers and heard her late husband's name cleared aloud, in front of witnesses, for the first time in nearly a year. She did not weep. She had promised herself, in April, that she would not weep in front of men who had spent a year assuming the worst of her. She intended to keep that promise even now, when the worst had finally, publicly, been undone. She wept later, at the cottage, alone. An hour after, a soft knock came at the door. She found the Duke of Ashvale had ridden the 2 miles from the manor. He had not come to comfort her. He understood by then that comfort was not what she wanted. He had come simply to sit with her at her own table, while she did the private work of it. It was exactly as he had once let her do the private work of the Mantraps. Alone, before dawn, unbothered by rescue she had not asked for. "You did not need saving," he said quietly, when the worst of it had passed. "You needed a witness. I should like, if you would permit it, to go on being one." There was no grand declaration. There was no ballroom, no scandal, no public spectacle of the kind the Tun so loved to manufacture from other people's happiness. There was only a widow of 33 and a duke of 36, sitting at a scarred cottage table with the last of the evening light going gold through the window. They agreed, in the quiet manner of two people who had each learned the hard way not to trust loud promises, to build something smaller than either of them had expected. Something truer, too. Something neither of them had thought life still owed them. They did not marry quickly. There was a decent interval to be observed. Rosalind, who had spent a year fighting for her own dignity, was not inclined to surrender the appearance of it now merely to satisfy impatience, her own or his. Gerard did not press her. He had learned, in the wood, that the surest way to lose her was to hurry her, and he had no intention of making that mistake twice. They married in October, without fanfare, in the small stone church at the edge of Ashvale Land. Rosalind wore, at her own insistence, the same grey cloak with the false lining, empty now of ledgers. She had told him she intended to remember, always, what she had carried before he arrived, and what she had not needed him to carry for her. Her only ornament was a small sapphire pin that had belonged to her own mother, worn not for its worth, but because it was the one thing Pruitt's schemes had never managed to touch. The village had spent a year speculating about the widow in the wood. It found itself with considerably less to say once the truth became plain. The Duke of Ashvale had not rescued a helpless woman. He had married one who had done, by her own hand, what an entire dukedom's resources had failed to do. There was a particular satisfaction, Rosalind found, in being envied for the wrong reasons by people who would never learn the right ones. She did not correct them. She had grown in the past year, rather fond of letting people believe whatever cost her the least. 2 years later, their daughter was born in the same cottage Rosalind had once nearly lost. Gerard had quietly purchased it outright before the wedding. He had settled it on her by name, so that no future misfortune, no future Pruitt, no future dead man's debt could ever again leave her without a roof that was unquestionably hers. They named the girl for no one in particular, which was, between the two of them, its own kind of vindication. A child who would inherit no one's ruin and no one's rescue. Only a mother who had cleared her own traps, and a father who had learned at last that the truest loyalty was not in saving someone, but in trusting her enough to let her finish. In the years that followed, it became a quiet habit of the estate. The servants noted it and never quite explained it to newcomers. The Duchess of Ashvale rose before dawn, several mornings each spring, and walked alone into Wraxall Wood. The Duke, more often than not, could be found some while later, standing at the edge of the ridge, watching, making no move to join her, until she herself looked up and beckoned him down. It was not, by then, a habit born of distance. It was a habit born of respect, kept deliberately, the way some couples keep a single object from the hardest year of their lives. Not to relive the hardship, but to remember exactly what they had built out of it. Pruitt was never seen again in that county. It was said some years later that he had taken a clerk's position in a distant town under a different name. The name did not save him. A reputation, it seemed, travelled faster than any man could outrun it. His cousin fared little better. Neither man's ruin gave Rosalind any particular satisfaction, though she noted, privately, that justice had cost her considerably less than mercy would have. The Dowager Duchess, Gerard's own mother, came at last to visit the cottage in the second year of the marriage. She had spent the first year insisting, with the particular stubbornness of the elderly, that a widow with a false-lined cloak was no fit match for a duke. She left 3 days later, having watched Rosalind manage a household ledger with a precision that put her own steward to shame. She was entirely converted, and rather ashamed of having doubted the matter at all. She never raised the subject of courtship again. There was, by then, nothing left to raise it about, and she had, at least, the good grace to admit it plainly over tea. Their daughter grew up hearing the story in pieces, the way children always do. Fragments came from the servants, who told it fondly, and never quite the same way twice. Fragments came from the dowager, who told it with considerably more admiration than she had once thought she would ever manage. By the time the girl was old enough to understand it properly, she had already decided something for herself. A woman who could spring a man-trap with her bare hands needed no man's permission to be extraordinary. She had decided, too, that a man who could watch such a woman from a ridge and let her finish was the rarer thing by far. He had not rushed down to claim the credit for her courage. He had simply let her keep it, entirely her own, which was, in its own quiet way, the greatest gift he had to give. She was not wrong. It was, in the end, precisely the inheritance her parents had meant to leave her. Not a title, not a fortune, only the plain and generational knowledge that love, worth having, was never granted. It was earned, quietly, by two people willing to let each other finish what they had started, and never once demanding to be thanked for the waiting.